This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I hope that you will join me in welcoming Tom Rawlings as today's visiting scholar in practice. He's going to share with us what I've termed his comparative approaches, his comparative insights. Tom has just returned from a very exciting post in Guatemala, and that has been part of his arc as a child advocate. You might know him best from his time as a juvenile court judge in our state. He was the first juvenile court judge in the Middle Judicial Circuit. After he left the bench, he was appointed by then Governor Perdue as the state child advocate. I had the very personal and professional privilege of serving as his deputy in that regard, and we really enjoyed that. I learned a lot from Tom and appreciate what I've described to be his courageous and fearless advocacy on behalf of children, but never reckless. He's very smart and creative in what he does. And so from there, though, he did take a 3-year assignment to Guatemala, where he worked with international justice missions, and he'll talk more about some of that work today, so I won't preview that for you. His full bio is in the materials that have been presented, and with that behind us, I think I'll just ask you to join me in welcoming Tom, and we'll get this underway.
Thanks, Melissa. This thing is working, I see. It's great to be back, both in the country and back at Emory. The last time I had the chance to speak at this CW, Child Welfare Legal Academy, was a few years ago, and I know I'm a lot grayer than I was then. But all of you look the same. So Melissa especially looks the same. She has just become much more important and famous as the years have gone by. As I always said, one day she'll be the boss of all of us. So, watch out. Anyway, good afternoon, and buenas tardes as well. A few questions before we begin. Have any of you ever been to Guatemala or Latin America? Okay. Guatemala, specifically, where were you?
The other departamentos, maybe like 5 other departamentos over 5 weeks, like Antigua in the north and after that Paz.
Okay. Anybody else? Latin America? Yeah.
Venezuela, just for a brief visit.
Okay. Anybody else?
Colombia.
Colombia.
And Venezuela.
Venezuela? Okay. Yeah, Chris there.
DR and Costa Rica.
Okay, good. I ended, just to kind of tell you how I ended up down there. I was one of those people who just loved going to Latin America, quite frankly. And so when I had the opportunity a few years ago to learn about this organization called International Justice Mission that was doing work not only in Guatemala but around the world, it's an organization that was doing legal work on behalf of victims as well as other multidisciplinary services. You can imagine that IJM is sort of a combination district attorney's office and child advocacy center in most of the countries in which it works. And so after trying desperately to learn Spanish for 20 years and short little trips here and there, and after learning enough to order a beer, and that's about it, I figured the best way to do it is actually to go live there. So in 2010, my wife and 3 boys and I headed down south to run the International Justice Mission office in Guatemala City. And I'll talk more about that in a few moments. But we're going to talk today specifically about child abuse issues in Latin America. Now, obviously, Latin America is a very big place, and obviously I'm going to focus on Guatemala. But I want you to consider that what I'm talking about goes beyond child abuse, and it goes beyond Latin America. You can almost consider this a discussion about the issues facing victims of all types, facing the poor, facing those who live in very desperate and difficult circumstances all around the world, and how what we as American attorneys and professionals, the way we look at things and how they are viewed there, and essentially what we can do about it, I believe, as well, long term, and how perhaps we should focus our thinking in terms of dealing with these particular issues of justice for the poor. That's a laser pointer. I hope it didn't shoot at you, any of you. All right, Guatemala itself. Some of you know well, so about 14 million people. It's probably the size of Georgia. It's one of those countries that, like many other developing countries around the world, has seen itself racked by civil war. How many of you, just to give you an example, this is civil war and the problems of countries in the developing world that have been controlled by a few. For example, in Africa, I think we were hearing this week that in Mali, correct, some of the rebels were going, and perhaps even the army as far as I know, were going around chopping off people's hands and legs. I've recently finished reading a book about King Leopold and the Belgian presence in the Congo back at the turn of the century. They essentially went in there primarily to exploit rubber resources. And when people didn't harvest enough rubber, they chopped off their hands or their legs. So these are the sorts of issues that are, quite frankly, worldwide. In Guatemala, the Civil War really erupted probably from a history going back to the conquest. Guatemala was, of course, invaded by the conquistadors in 1523, finally taken over, and the indigenous Maya there were essentially ruled and treated as slaves for a very long time. In the early 20th century, the United Fruit Company came in, and in some ways simply replaced the conquistadors in terms of their very strict labor practices, the way they sort of oppressed the poor and ended up using the poor to get fruit and to get bananas and coffee and whatnot. In the 60s, really almost going back to the late 50s, you had a very, I think, severe division between the urban, educated and wealthy, and the rural, extremely poor. Those sort of tensions over the plight of the poor erupted in the Civil War. That Civil War lasted until 1996 and was really highlighted by the early 80s when the government was essentially waging a scorched earth campaign up in Shela, up in the highlands of Guatemala. You've got a central ridge here that runs, I don't know if you can see this too well. You've got a central ridge that runs down the country, mountainous ridge, and up in this area, there was genocide, there was mass rape, there was really a Holocaust in some places. So what you ended up with was, after the peace accords in 1996, a country which is democratic, at least officially, but is still very much a post-conflict society. And so it is like a lot of other countries around the world, a lot of the developing world. You had, perhaps not specifically recent colonialism, but certainly in other parts of the world, in Africa and other places, a lot of what you see today is post-conflict, post-colonial societies, and so what you have are many of the same issues. And so we're going to talk about those issues today, and especially the issues of the relationship between the poor and the government in these countries. You also have in Guatemala an interesting situation, and I think this is also reflected in other developing world countries, where Guatemala itself receives $350 million a year, each year, in direct foreign aid, government foreign aid. The U.S. alone gave $112 million in foreign aid in 2010. Where is this money going, and to what use is it being put? And is it actually helping the society? These are the kind of questions we want to look at today. But I really want to focus on children. Now, as I said, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today And by the way, you can interrupt me at any time you want with a question or a comment or to throw fruit, okay? It's okay. I want to focus on children because children are one of the several categories of vulnerable individuals that we deal with. And really what we're talking about in terms of our work in child welfare is not just about the protection of children. It's not just about caring for children who've been abused. It is about protecting a vulnerable population and what we can do as lawyers and as other professionals to make sure that the vulnerable are cared for, protected, and that they can actually see justice and the right thing being done by them. In Guatemala, 17% of families make less than $1.25 today. If you look around the world, there's billions, probably 1 billion people in that situation. 53% of families live in poverty by Guatemalan standards, okay? We're not talking about some, American standard. We're talking about by Guatemala's own standards. To give you sort of an example, in Guatemala City, there's a very large dump. It's in the middle of town. If you Google Guatemala City dump, some of you might want to do that now, you'll see a picture of it. Each week there are probably 2,000 families that work in that dump. Unofficially, they don't really work there. What they do is they go in, and when the trucks bring more piles of garbage, they pick through the garbage to get plastic that can be recycled. They recycle that plastic, maybe make 50 cents a day on a good day. But at the same time, Guatemala and Honduras have the highest per capita ownership of private helicopters in the world. Okay? So, probably shouldn't put this on tape, but I'm going to. If anybody from Sandersville's out there, it's just an example. Some of y'all know I'm from Sandersville, Georgia, which is a very small rural community. I love it, grew up there. But in some ways, coming back from Guatemala, which because it does have a fairly wealthy population in some areas, is very much a cosmopolitan city. And so coming back to Sandersville is a bit like coming to the third world, to the developing world. So in Guatemala City, you can have whatever fast food you want, great restaurants. The sushi places deliver, okay? So it is really a very stark contrast between a very wealthy few, a somewhat of a middle class, and then a very large, very poor population. That poverty is expressed oftentimes and really damages children. 49% of the population under 5 suffer chronic malnutrition. Now that's almost half of the population of young children. Okay, we're talking about children who are drinking a little bit of coffee and eating a tortilla or two, for the first 5 years of their lives. That's their daily meal. It is, in some ways, worse than Haiti in terms of the actual chronic malnutrition of children. In some of the Mayan areas, we all are familiar with the Mayan ruins, and we all ask where the Mayans went. Well, the Mayans are still there. The indigenous population of Central America simply became for the large part, those who were oppressed by the conquistadors. And so in some of the rural highlands of the country, the child malnutrition problem is up to 80% of children. The schooling. The average school completion for these children is 4.1 years overall. 71% of eligible secondary students are not enrolled. For all children.
For all children.
Yes. And of course, when you consider that half of them, you've got the numbers are skewed. So to give you an example, my children went to an international school with the children of the family that owns the Pollo Campero restaurant chain, and they had the best education in the world. But at the same time, so many families have almost no school. And so it really skews those numbers. 1.37 million children don't have access to health services. I can tell you that if you go to the hospital in Guatemala City, the large state hospitals, you need to bring your own supplies. You need to pay for your own medicine. Now, on top of this, look, folks, I think many of you already know these numbers should not be anything that shocks you. This is truly how children in a large part of the developing world live. Okay, despite these flaws, despite the lack of food, clothing, and shelter, they often, in fact, can live a very productive and happy life. Okay, material goods are not everything, but on top of that, you have the issue of violence. And if there's one thing I've learned working with International Justice Mission and just kind of working a little bit overseas here and there the last few years, is that for the world's poor and developing countries, the real problem is not just a lack of things. It is something active, and that active thing that hurts them is chronic violence. There was a UN study a few years ago that came out that suggested that 1 billion people in the world live without the basic protections of a justice system. So that even if they have food, clothing, shelter, it can be taken away from them by those who are more powerful, and even worse, those who are more powerful and who do not respect the law can also take away these individuals' dignity and very lives. If you look at the history of these post-conflict countries, you've got, in Guatemala, how many of you have learned about trauma? Everybody knows the effects of trauma on individuals, right? Well, imagine an entire society that has been traumatized by 40 years of civil war. What you have, of course, is a society that has become increasingly violent. And even though the war is over, the murder rate in Guatemala has doubled in the last decade. 16.5% of the population has been a victim of a violent crime in the last year in Guatemala. This is very similar to the figures in El Salvador and in Honduras, Mexico to some extent in the drug turf areas, and to a growing extent in Costa Rica and Panama. Nicaragua is still actually a fairly safe place to be if you want to go take a vacation. But these other countries have really experienced a great uprise in violence. But it's not just the violence occurs, it occurs with impunity. In these countries, and in fact in India, in parts of Africa, and a number of developing countries, you will typically see that the impunity rate is between 95 and 98%. In other words, only 3 to 5% of violent crimes even are ever successfully prosecuted such that there is a resolution that makes the victim feel protected and that does something to the offender. Okay, that may sound a little strange because, well, how on earth can a society function when then there's no law enforcement? Well, because you have to remember that the vast majority of the individuals, the families in these countries are very poor. And they are the ones who must rely on a public justice system, public police officers, public prosecutors, and public judges. Those who can afford to have private security, to arbitrate their disputes in a private arbitration, that is what they do. And in fact, if you see in Guatemala as well as in other parts of Central America, The private security guards actually outnumber the police and army by 5 to 1. Yes?
Ineffective police.
We're going to get to that, so hold that thing. Part of it is corruption, part of it's ineffective police. Part of it is a lack of resources. I do want to come back to that. So hold that thought, please. The question, of course, is why? Why are these cases, why is there such impunity? It's also, this is, I think, one of the things that I think business needs to understand is that part of the, we all want to see underdeveloped countries, whether in Africa, Asia, Latin America, we want to see them develop. We know that by bringing industry and commerce and helping people start small businesses and microfinance and these sort of things, that we can perhaps raise the standard of living of these individuals. But we also know that violence in these countries actually is a great depressor of economic growth. And in fact, it's been calculated by the World Bank that in Guatemala, the cost of crime is like 7.5% or almost 8% of the GDP each year. To give you an example of just how violent it is, in Spain in 2006, Spain has about 40 million people. There were 336 murders. In Central America, which also, all of Central America has about 40 million people, there were 14,000 murders. So, and this is the kind of daily thing that folks deal with. You deal with people being shot on the street. You try to take the bus to work because it only costs a few quetzales, which is maybe a dime or something. But somebody wants to extort money out of the bus driver, so they blow up the bus. They kill the bus driver and you. And as a result, you know who gets lost in the mix of all this? It's children. So we've talked a little bit generally about how the violence affects the population, right? Well, think about it this way. You're living in a very poor neighborhood in Guatemala City. There are drug trafficking gangs. There are the attacks on the buses. There's all these, quite frankly, big crimes. Okay. Who gets left out when they're victimized? Who has the least voice? It is the children, in fact. It's very difficult to find good statistics on the level of child abuse in Guatemala or in any other developing country, quite frankly. The CDC a few years ago tried to do an assessment. It just wasn't really good. A couple of different things. The women in Guatemala and in Central America will often tell you, will tell you fairly quickly in many cases about domestic violence. It's a big problem. Nobody wants to talk about sexual violence. Of course, that's not really surprising. This country, we talk about child sexual violence all the time, sexual violence against children all the time, and yet we have Jerry Sandusky, right? So we have the same cultural issues that prevent us from speaking out. But the bottom line is we don't get very good statistics. We know that each year in Guatemala there are 4,000 denuncias filed. Those for child sexual abuse alone. Okay, those are formal criminal complaints. I mean, someone has gone, not usually necessarily to the police, but really moreover to the Ministerio Público, which is the general prosecutor's office. You think about a country the size of Georgia. Everything's spread out, but you got really one central authority, one central prosecuting authority, and there are different branches of that. So folks actually go to the Ministerial Publico, they file criminal complaints, they say that I have discovered that my daughter has been sexually abused, I discovered my son has been sexually abused, I want something done about it. 4,000 each year, and UNICEF estimates that that's severely underreported, and that the actual numbers are conservatively between 4 and 6 times that. Okay. Anecdotally, I can tell you that there are large numbers of births to girls between ages 10 and 14, especially up in the rural areas. And I did some back of the napkin calculations one day based on some very conservative numbers. If you look at the number of births per capita to girls between the ages of 10 and 14 in Guatemala, and you compare that to the births to the same age group of Latina girls in the United States, the rates in Guatemala are at least 4 times that of the U.S. So I think, yes. Yes.
The same rate, because I believe it wasn't until the early 20s that we raised the age of consent to the age of 16.
I don't know. That's a very good question. I have a sort of a private theory that the Civil War and the destruction of the Civil War may have contributed severely to this problem. I don't know though. That's a very good question. If you think about Eastern Europe, and you think about what happened during communism, especially under like Ceausescu in Romania, the people who were born and reared and grew up during that time are very different psychologically from the younger generation. And so I have sort of this personal theory that because of all the violence that was going on in this country for 40 years, that you ended up with a traumatized culture. And so just as we have all seen children who have been traumatized grow up to be adults who are traumatized and perhaps lash out at others, I think that you've seen some of that. That's just my private theory. I can't prove it. Now, this is very important though. 4,000 formal criminal complaints each year. Talk about impunity. There are only 200 to 250 successful prosecutions. What's that percentage? Somebody who knows math? You people are not math majors, are you? About 5%. Very good. Why don't people report? Why aren't there more convictions? That's a very good point, and we're going to get into that because that is one of the issues. I want to talk a little bit about justice because I have the next slide is the big question: why? I have here a thing that says. Let me check my timing here. It says justice, and maybe some of you have seen this. I stole this from somebody. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Dave. And so you have, essentially, in any system, you have the individual, you have relationships, you have community, and you have society. And really, a society's level of justice is based upon the interactions and the qualities and the characteristics of each of these. And they reinforce each other. But then you put on top of that poverty. And I would suggest to you that poverty has an extreme effect on the individual's ability to obtain justice, on the relationship between the individual and the community, and as a result, when entire communities are heavily impoverished, that you have a situation where unless the society, this thing's not working, unless the society is truly working on and focused on bringing justice to those poor communities, that you won't have justice. So the big question, We're going to use child sexual abuse here as a proxy for all child maltreatment, including physical as well as commercial sexual exploitation. Issues in Guatemala, as I mentioned, are very typical of third world countries. Given what you know now, what would you do to address the issue of child abuse in a developing country? Don't be shy. Actually, that might work. I think it's called specific deterrence. Anybody else?
Kids in school. Get the kids in good schools.
School, okay, education. Okay. Did you know that I've had clients in Guatemala who, especially out in the rural areas, the entire community was afraid to send their girls to school because the teacher was molesting them, and nobody would do anything about it. Yes? Sorry? Alleviate poverty. Okay, very good. Have an advocate for these children. Okay. Anybody else? These are all good ideas. I'll tell you what it's not a problem of. It's not a problem of laws. I've got a sheet at the end of this thing. Y'all can have this PowerPoint. I'll email it to you if you want it. But the laws in Guatemala are great. They are written. They have whoever wrote them, was some brilliant person from Latin America or from Europe or from the United States. Who knows? But all the laws, in fact, everywhere I've been, the laws are great. We have the Ley contra la Violencia Sexual Explotación y Trata de Personas, which is probably what all of you who are child advocates have advocated that the Georgia legislature or the Congress adopt here. Okay, we have the Ley de Protección Integral. All of the concepts that we in child welfare law are familiar with: family preservation, least restrictive placement, placement with extended family, permanency, mandated victim services, restitution, procedures for protecting victims from re-traumatization. All of these are covered in the laws. Yes?
The UN...
Oh, yeah, they adopted it long ago.
Which we haven't.
We haven't, but they have. And I'm telling you, the laws are great. The laws on the books are great. That's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. Yes?
So, does Guatemala have almost like a DFACS agency?
We're going to get into that if you give me a break. Not a break. Give me a break before the break.
Okay.
What we don't have is, we're going to figure out what we don't have. What we have is we'll have an incidente. Okay, nothing is different in these countries, and I know I can tell you from my research and from working with International Justice Mission that it's always the same. Child sexual abuse is always the same. It's always a neighbor. It's always a live-in boyfriend. It's always a relative. It's very seldom the mass pedophile. Okay, occasionally that happens. There's always problems of discovery. There are big barriers to discovery, though. And this is one issue. This is where I think education comes in. Folks don't know, in some parts, don't even know that this is something they should report because there is not a culture in which they have been taught bad touch, good touch, necessarily in some places. But also, how many of you have worked with domestic violence victims? How many of them don't report because they are economically dependent upon the aggressor? Well, think about living in near the city dump in Guatemala City, and you have an even worse economic dependency situation. There is no social safety net for the single mother, other than prostitution or begging in the streets. It's often discovered by the pregnancy of the child or even the birth, perhaps for a hospital visit. Perhaps there's oftentimes, our usual thing was that the child would tell an aunt finally, or we'd find out at the hospital would call us, or disclosure to the mother. But even then, the barriers to reporting are even more significant. Now, I think you mentioned this, yes?
Reporting was the fear of the police itself.
Okay, yeah, exactly.
So, and the fact that the constables also came from those low-income communities, and that
Yes,
it's all within the same circles.
exactly. One of the, even when we have a report, okay, people don't report, and I put up a couple things. There are the economic dependence on the aggressor, the cultural taboo, the threats by the aggressor. But one of the big issues is that the lack of trust by trust of the authorities, and the fact that they treat the victims so poorly. Okay. Here's a big point for you, and this is not original to me. This is actually something I learned from my boss. His name is Gary Haugen. He's actually talking about this in a book he's writing right now. In many countries, especially countries that were colonized, like India, the justice system was not set up to protect the poor or to protect the vulnerable from those with power. It was to protect those with power from the poor. And so as a result, police do not necessarily see their job traditionally as protecting and serving, unless, of course, they're protecting and serving those who have. Victims are often treated very poorly by the system. On top of that, you simply have a situation, as I said, in Guatemala where there are 5 times as many private security guards as police officers. They're just heavily outgunned. They're just under-resourced. They don't have what it is that they need. And there has been corruption in these places. Corruption in Guatemala and also in other countries based on the fact that the police officers were paid so poorly that really they felt the only way they could survive was to do what all of their friends were doing, which is to take. Okay? So this is a real issue. I've got going to try something a little bit different here. I think we need to, before the break at least, kind of give you a little idea of what the actual system is in Guatemala. And this is not much different from a lot of countries. The difference as I have seen in various countries is whether the court system or the justice system is running an inquisitorial method, whereby the court is mostly paperwork and all that kind of stuff, or whether it's done in more of an adversarial system. Most of the Latin American systems are moving more toward the adversarial system now. So for example, in Guatemala for the last 8 years, they have had, or 10 years now, they have had primarily oral trials the way we do with live witnesses, as opposed to having everything written down on paper. So you'll have an incident. And as I said, that incident is likely to happen in a very poor neighborhood with high levels of violence, where the barriers to that incident being reported are severe. Poverty, fear, and especially, as you pointed out, lack of trust of the police or other authorities, who are not seen necessarily as your friends, but as those who oppress you. Now, if you get to the point of having the courage to overcome that, you can actually go to this facility in Guatemala City, which is the Ministerio Público, the Office of Permanent Detention, and 24 hours a day you can file a criminal complaint. It's actually a very nice facility. But you do that, you don't go to the police because, as you said, you can't trust them to even turn in the report, and they may ridicule you if they're not well trained. Yeah.
Just talk to somebody, because most of them can't read or write.
Yes, if they go to the public ministry, then they in fact go and speak to an intake officer. Okay? And there at the public ministry, not necessarily in all the areas, but at least in Guatemala City, with its 4 million people, they can have the Office of Victim Assistance, the Office of Permanent Attention, and the Red de Derivación. In other words, there are some services for victims. They are few and far between. They are very good when they exist, but they simply are not sufficient. So in other words, what I want to say here is that when you go to file a report that you've been a victim of a crime in Guatemala City, you're not dealing with people who don't understand you and who don't care necessarily. You're dealing with people who are oftentimes, though, overwhelmed and under-resourced. In my experience, if you got to the prosecuting officials, you actually had a decent chance of succeeding. You can't necessarily trust the police on many cases, but there is a pretty good cadre of prosecutors, and I think the American Bar Association in its recent report, which I referenced in here, would agree with that. They're still under-resourced, however. The investigation, however, is where things break down. I've got it in a little bit, but I will go ahead and tell you that of all those 4,000 complaints, criminal complaints, right? I told you there are only 200 resolutions each year. Okay, it's not the fact that the DAs, the district attorneys are overworked, the judges are overworked. But our study at IJM Guatemala found that that if you actually got the case to what they call the first instance judge, which is here, it's like the magistrate judge, that you actually had a chance, a pretty good chance of having a successful resolution, at least having a trial. This is where it breaks down. So, to investigate a child sexual abuse or a rape, if you have the courage to report it, you're going to have a special doctor come out to your house or to the hospital where you are, as well as a prosecutor. You think that doesn't seem very caring for the victim, is it? Your own doctor, who might do the rape study kit, is not sufficient. You have to have the official government doctor, accompanied by a prosecutor. Right. And additionally, because there are simply so few investigators, and they don't necessarily have the services to follow up with the victims, this is where all the cases are being dropped. This is where the vast majority of cases die, is between the time the person files a criminal complaint and the time that it gets to this guy, the first instance judge. The other issue, of course, besides the actual investigation of the crime to obtain evidence and to encourage the victim to actually stick with the process, the other issue is the issue of actually apprehending the criminal. The police do not have the resources to go out and look for fugitives. Y'all remember John McAfee in the paper recently? The founder of McAfee, antivirus, who fled Belize. And where did he go? Guatemala. And I'm sure he went to Guatemala because somebody told him that you can disappear into the mountains and nobody will ever find you. Once you get to the first instance judge, as I said, it's very much a process like that in the United States. The judge hears sufficient evidence to create an accusation, and then it goes to the tribunal, which of course is the trial court. And as I said, once you get there, you have a pretty good chance of succeeding. But you have these major issues with regard to lack of trust of the authorities. 58% of Guatemalans say they wouldn't report a crime against them. 66% say that police are involved in crime. And so poor investigations and poor response by police is a major factor here. As I said, though, once you get into the court system, then you've actually got a pretty good chance of succeeding. But the breakdown is coming between the time the denuncia is filed and the time you have a warm body to prosecute has been arrested and the case has been investigated and goes to that first instance judge. Lack of arrests is one issue. Lack of protection and services for the victim is, in my opinion, the number one issue. These victims are already distrustful of the system. They abandon their cases because they're simply ignored. So if you want to know why there's impunity in criminal justice system in so many of these countries, whether it's Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras or India or a country in Africa, Rwanda or Nigeria or Kenya, for example. To me, the number one issue, other than lack of trust of police and lack of police resources, is lack of attention for the victim, lack of caring for the victim. They do have these services in place, but they are so under-resourced that they can't get anywhere. And so the question to me is, what do you do about that? How do you get them the resources they need? I want to take a break in 2 minutes. We're going to take like a 5-minute break, and y'all can get a drink and use the restroom. But in doing that, I don't want to, it sounds like I'm Mr. Gloom and Doom up here. Things are working in Guatemala, and I have seen that the same sorts of progress is being made in other countries. There are decent conviction rates when some of these newer procedures are used, okay? So, for example, in the case of children, UNICEF a few years ago put in forensic interview rooms. We're all familiar with those, right? Like we have in the child advocacy centers. But what they're finally now getting around to implementing these things. There are more and more organizations that are providing intensive services for these children, both from the government itself as well as from non-governmental organizations. If you go to the juvenile court in Guatemala City, they're now using closed-circuit TV in almost all of their cases to interview children. So these children are not re-traumatized. So there is hope there. I also think you see that there is an improved prosecutorial and judicial corps, at least in Guatemala, and I think we're going to see that around the world in the coming years. They're actually making some progress in reducing corruption, in training prosecutors. There is much more of a move to the oral adversarial justice system, but there are judges who remain very resistant to these new methods. So, with that said, I think we've got a pretty good picture of what's been going on with regard to the criminal justice process for children who've been victimized and why that process is not working. So let's take a short break, and then we'll come back a little bit and talk about the child protection system. And in the interim, I'll be answering questions. So, all right, we'll get started back. Take your time, but I just want to make sure we get out of here before so the dean can have this room. We don't want to get Melissa in trouble. They might dock her pay or something. Let's talk a little bit about we've talked about a little bit about the criminal justice process. And let's talk a little bit about the child protection process. And let's hope this works. Going back to Prezi. Okay, someone was asking me earlier whether that was like a DFAX. Okay. It's a little complicated. There is and there isn't. The child abuse cases are supposed to be handled in terms of protection by various municipal child protection boards, very much like the municipal social work organization, kind of like the local DFAX office. However, if any type of legal protection is needed, they must call the Procuraduría General de la Nación, which is the equivalent of our Attorney General's office. The PGN has a particular children's unit. It's a multidisciplinary unit, and they have social workers and investigators and attorneys who will bring cases before the children's courts, Juzgados de la Niñez, to protect children. Some of the dilemmas they've had, however, are this. They haven't until recently prioritized child sexual abuse cases or physical abuse cases. they actually would treat a child's claim that that the educational rights of the child are being deprived the exact same as these other cases. And so you had this huge backlog. And when it came to actually trying to get a child removed, there is in Guatemala City a single woman. I hope maybe she's gotten some help now. There's a single woman, Sarah Paez, who was responsible for all of the intake calls for children to be removed. I felt so bad for her. There are a total of 5 attorneys for all of Guatemala. I think maybe we're at like 7 or 8 now. But at one point there were a total of like 5 attorneys to handle all of the child abuse cases in Guatemala City's children's courts. The intakes, of course, might come from the city social workers, from the police, from mostly, however, from prosecutors and from non-governmental organizations such as ours. So, for example, Doctors Without Borders might very well call. They ran the sexual violence clinics in the city. The problem, of course, and again, it's not a lack of caring. These folks do care. In fact, Sarah was very, very compassionate and dedicated and passionate about what she did. But they're just overwhelmed. Once the intake is done, they can remove the child. They have to get, as here, the order of the children's court judge. There are 5 children's courts in Guatemala City. They used to be spread all around. They finally housed them all in one building, which was something that UNICEF helped with. And once that's done, they are placed. Now, this is where the real issues come up. Sorry, there are 2 real issues. Number one, of course, there are plenty of children out there in danger and not enough attorneys and social workers and resources to help them. But the dilemma is that if you actually get the child into a placement, the child may not need a placement. You look at the law, Decreto 40 de 2010, Decree 40 of 2010 of the Guatemalan Supreme Court. Reads as if Michelle Barkley wrote it, okay? Or Chris Church or Melissa Carter. You know what I mean. It says we're going to use the least restrictive placement possible. We're going to make sure that we do an intensive search for relatives, okay? We're going to use Family Finder or whatever. We're going to keep this child in the community if possible and safe within that community. We're going to avoid the traumatization of yanking this child out of the situation they're in and putting them in a home. Okay? But the problem is that those services in Guatemala frankly don't exist. There's very little in the way of services within the community for keeping families together, for family preservation. Even though the law calls for it, even though the policies call for it, it's simply not there. And so what happens is if the child can't be protected in the home, they may be sent to a good children's home, which actually has some therapy, that kind of thing. But they also may be sent to the Hogar Solidario, which is a large institution. It's a lot better than it used to be. But it still holds about 750 to 800 children. And you still got serious issues there. Yes? Right, they do on paper. And this is another thing. If you look at, this is what I mean, and I'm sure Michelle, hey Michelle, I'm sure she'll watch this. She's on the video, not, sorry, y'all looking at me funny. I'm sure Michelle will see this. I've actually talked to her about this issue. Like I said, if you look at what's written down there in terms of the continuum of services that are supposed to exist for children, you've got keeping the child in the home with wraparound services, so to speak. you've got family foster care, you've got, maybe a therapeutic foster care or a group home. You've got all these things on paper that simply don't exist. There are maybe 2 or 3 family foster parents that I'm aware of, and I think part of it is there has not been a culture of fostering up to now. Melissa?
I suspect that there's not a well-established financing mechanism that would support the development of those services and placements,
Right.
like that we have here, arguably.
Yes, there's not a well-established financing mechanism. The government, for example, would provide some level of support for a foster family, but there has not been enough funding or enough attention given to creating that system. And then when, as I said earlier, there's so much foreign aid that flows into Guatemala, but it's one of those situations where you got to have something that's sustainable. There may be a pilot program done or a pilot project, but after a while, it just goes away. My suggestion sort of has been that, well, let's put it this way: you've got lots and lots of American humanitarian assistance from private individuals flowing into Guatemala, much of it faith-based. Unfortunately, you have that money sometimes flowing to a home, to a structure, because it is associated with a structure. We've all done this. Those of us who've been involved in child welfare, especially in in raising money for child welfare issues, know that it's often easier to get people to fund a place than it is to fund a service. And so we've also got, I think, work to be done in changing the idea of the private funder, that you don't necessarily need, the home is just a very small part of what's necessary. What's necessary is a continuum of services, including community-based services and foster care.
My only experience with Guatemala and the treatment of children in Guatemala was when I was in adoption practice with private adoptions. Guatemala at the time, now a handful of years ago, but I think it's the same, was considered a really good place to work with for international adoptions, and in part because the children were placed not in orphanages like you hear about East European countries, for example, but in family foster care while they were waited connection and placement and finalization of adoptions with Americans or whoever. And so one is that, does that seem to be true? And then that must be operating completely independently of what their child protection services system is, given that there are no foster families and placements?
I think you may have been working with some fairly high-end adoption providers, because in general, that's not the case. And what really I think is especially lacking in Guatemala is the idea of providing services to get these children from an institution back into the community in some way. Whoops. There we go. There's a 2008 study, Melissa, done by Holt International, and they showed that 95% of the children's homes in Guatemala are actually private, okay? But almost none of them offered educational services, therapeutic services, certainly not family reintegration services. And the really scary part is this. At that time, they counted 5,600 children who were placed in residential care in Guatemala in 2008. 33% had been declared permanent residents. Now, these were all between 8 and, say, 16 years of age. So in other words, these are children who, if there were a permanency plan, it would be that they live there until they're 18. And I don't want to knock them. In many cases, I'm sure that the home would provide college even for these children, and they would care for them. But at some point, these children would leave that institution and go out into the community with very little in the way of family contacts. Now, as far as adoption in Guatemala, Y'all may know that since about 2007 or 2008, it's been completely cut off. What you had, and I've really kind of gotten to see the Guatemalan end of that, talking to people at the Guatemalan embassy in Washington and some folks like that, is that you had, this is where your corruption came in. There was probably $40,000 to be made in the adoption process by those who could even steal a child, and that's happened on occasion. Attorneys who would fake documents, judges even in some cases who would accept a fake DNA test, and so it was a very bad situation. I think that's also part of the reason that you now see so many children who are coming into residential placement in Guatemala who perhaps the old adoption plan, the old permanency plan would have been for an international adoption. But now they're not doing that. The government has basically said, look, we want to get this started again at some time, but right now we're just not comfortable with the way things are going, and so we're going to hold it all up until we feel like everything is settled down and we have a system in which we can trust to not steal children. Yes?
From the police in Guatemala, and it said, do not approach children in public places because there's this reputation of foreigners stealing children. Some tourists have been beaten to death or something because they thought he was stealing a child. So
there was kind of that rumor going around, especially up in some of the highland areas, and that the Americans are here to steal our children. So you did have to be careful about that. But as you can see, so again, this is a situation, to sum that up, where what's on paper is great. And the question, of course, is how do you take what the country has expressed as what its goal is, which is a very modern child welfare system, child protection system that is in line with international standards. How do you go from there to actually implementing that system? That is the problem. Now, I've given you all this bad news about Guatemala, which I love. So any of my Guatemalan friends who are watching this video we're making, I want them to know I love this country. It's been one of the, my wife and I would have stayed there forever, but our oldest son was really wanting to come home. So, so the question, of course, is what do you do? I want to go back to 50 years ago in the United States. 50 years ago in the U.S., we're going to say 1950 or so, okay? If you were a child sexual abuse victim, number one, you didn't exist, right? If you happened to be discovered, some man, police officer, would interrogate you to make sure you weren't lying. Some doctor would perhaps rough you up in an examination. And then you would be questioned in open court in front of the defendant and made to look like a fool, right? It wasn't until the early 1970s that anybody began to say, well, look, this child abuse thing really must exist. It's not just, an occasional thing. It actually happens. And so we began to pass federal laws that required a multidisciplinary approach to child welfare. We developed child advocacy centers. We developed the court-appointed special advocates program. And we are now, at least 50 years later, in the position where if you heard that a football coach at Penn State had been molesting children and had gotten away with it, you would be livid, and if you're the NCAA, you'll sanction them for $60 million, and you're going to prosecute everybody who didn't report. In other words, our attitude has shifted not from this doesn't really exist and I can't believe he did that, to I can't believe you didn't report that, and I can't believe that didn't get prosecuted timely. So there is, yes.
Money for programs that were here that, were designed to provide support services to women and children in those situations.
Well, you're right, and funding continues to be an issue. And I think funding will always be an issue, but I do think at least in what we consider in society to be our social demand remains high. Our social demand does not always equate to a congressional supply of funds like it ought to, but at least, I think we as a society have stood up and said, we are not going to let this happen, and we are going to take steps to try to protect children from it happening and to treat those it happens to. So UNICEF has done really yeoman's work in modernizing child protection systems and child justice systems around Latin America. They are the ones that have taken, in many cases, these laws and created protocols for implementing the laws, created techniques for protecting victims, training the attorneys from the PGN, training and funding decent police officers who actually know what they're doing and who will treat a victim with sensitivity. And I would say that if you look, what I have dealt with over the last 3 years, I have seen that within the region at least, certainly in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in places like Argentina and Chile, of course, they are doing a much more in terms of adopting these international best practices, even if to do so is still a bit aspirational. They are trying to get there. And of course, I think the biggest hope for change is greater social demand. In Guatemala, and I think this is internationally something we've got to focus on, the situation I was discussing with you about the rape in India, that is the kind of thing you see women standing up finally and saying, we are not tolerating this. In Guatemala in 2012, the British ambassador, Julie Chappelle, helped organize a huge event against domestic violence. It was totally social media driven. It was all over Facebook. They sold tickets to raise money against domestic violence for various programs. And the whole point was that you buy your ticket and you and your friends get to climb the volcano, the Agua volcano, the water volcano outside Antigua, Guatemala, which towers about 6,000 feet over the terrain. 40,000 people bought tickets and climbed that volcano. See, and that's the kind of thing that I think is going to generate social demand and perhaps can change the situation for victims in these countries. And of course, I do want to take a minute at least to talk about our specific work. Apologize for the advertisement, but I think this is the kind of thing that does work. As I said, one of the things that attracted me about International Justice Mission and going down there was that I've always, at least I've learned in my juvenile court and child advocate work, that lawyers aren't everything, but then again, lawyers combined with other professionals in a multidisciplinary approach truly can make a difference for abused children. So what IJM provides in Guatemala, as well as in other countries, is social services for victims, prosecutorial assistance to prosecute the offenders, as well as services designed to transform the justice system. So, what we would do, and as I said, one of the biggest gaps in these countries is the gap between the incident and getting to court, okay? Because too many victims are afraid to report, and those who do report are treated poorly by the system because the system is not set up to help them. And if they can simply get in front of the judge with the evidence and with some legal assistance, they can actually achieve a conviction and feel that the one who hurt them has been convicted and justice has been done. So we set our organization up in Guatemala such that we now receive referrals on cases directly from the prosecutors because we because our team, which is all Guatemalans down there, have developed such a close relationship with the prosecutors and the DA's offices, or the Ministerio Público, as we call them, are they realize that it's very valuable to have this outside support. Those of us who are in child welfare in Georgia often are on the CASA program or the Child Advocacy Center for the same types of services. So we would receive the family. We would actually start therapy for the victim. And we would do an assessment on the family to see if the offender still around? Is the offender still in the home? Has the mother had the courage to kick out the offender, which means she is now in economic dire straits? What do we need to do to serve this family? And we, as well, would walk that family through the process, essentially holding their hand as they went through the process and counseling them as they sought justice for their case. Another thing, as I said, is one of the biggest issues is having a warm body to prosecute. So although the denuncia might be filed and an arrest warrant issued, the man would just disappear into another neighborhood, perhaps even. So we developed a relationship with the police officer detectives who investigate sex crimes, who are decent people. And we actually, our investigators had the time and the resources to go out and knock on doors and ask questions and track down these men against whom there were arrest warrants. And so we would essentially go and organize the arrest. And we would when we knew where the man was, we would call the police would come and arrest him, and lo and behold, we had a warm body to prosecute them. And so as a result, our team down there was responsible for about a third of all arrests of sex offenders in Guatemala City in any given year. We did most of that with one investigator who had no law enforcement background. He was actually had worked with street children for 16 years. And of course, the other part is the legal part. Now, we can't do this in the U.S., of course. We don't have private prosecutors, but in Guatemala, as well as in some other countries, in Latin America especially, you can be a querellante adhesivo. So in other words, you can go and represent the victim in the criminal case. And so we had lawyers to do that. One of the lawyers I want to mention to you, her name is Jessica. And I told you about the violence and the traumatization of this that occurred to this country. Jessica was she was the daughter of a prominent education professor at the University of San Carlos, who, despite all the threats to anyone who is considered a leftist or on the left in the early 80s, decided he was going to stay and teach at the university, and because he was a Guatemalan. And the government gunned him down 3 blocks from his house when she was about 8 years old. And despite that, she now works closely with the government in prosecuting child sexual abuse cases. And those are the kind of people that we had. So, you know, it's not as if on any of these things, it's not like we need a bunch of Americans to come in and do this work. There are good people in each of these countries who care about these issues, but who need the support to be able to do this work. But we did, you know, because we were able to go into court on these cases, we could also bring our social workers and protect the victim during the process, and make sure that the forensic interview room or the closed circuit TV was used instead of placing the victim on the stand. And as a result, we ended up with victims who, perhaps still difficult going through a trial like this, but at least we reduced their level of re-traumatization. And of course, the bigger issue is that you've got to figure out a way in this country and in other developing countries to make the public justice system work for the poor. And that involves, I think, a combination of advocacy and social demand, but I think it also requires those of us who are in the legal field to focus our efforts on implementation of the good laws that we already have on the books around the world. We all know that this is sort of a standard IJM slide that my boss there, Gary Haugen, always used. The standard justice system. You take an injustice, you run it through the police and the prosecutors and the judges and the social workers, and what you get at the end is things made right. The victim restored, the offender held accountable, correct? Well, I think what we see in the third world oftentimes is that you have corrupt or under-resourced police officers, ill-trained prosecutors, unaccountable judges, and overwhelmed and overworked social workers. And so what you get in those systems, even though no matter how beautiful their laws are, you end up putting the victim through the ringer, so that truly the good deed they have done of reporting the crime doesn't go unpunished. They are punished for their diligence in seeking justice. I think overall, if there were a couple of things I could do, and kind of could encourage people to focus on in terms, both really here in the United States as well as in the developing world, are this. Number one, how do we build public confidence in the justice system? What are we going to do to make sure that when a crime occurs or that when a child is abused, that the response is sensitive, the needs of the victim, appropriate, and timely? Okay. Here in the United States, we have, I think, made a great deal of progress on that. I still think we have a long way to go. But the issues in the developing world are much more significant, because you do have this history where the police was used as a tool of colonial powers, perhaps, and where the poor especially see the police and see law enforcement and see government as a tool of the oppressor and not as a source of help. Number two, I think that in my personal opinion, and just from what I've seen, we in the developed world, when we tend to look at the developing world, we take our approaches in a number of ways that are not necessarily complete or that are misguided. Number one, I don't care how much money we spend on a problem. If our solution is to simply start a program or send food aid or try to alleviate poverty by throwing money at a problem, it's not going to happen. The reason that our team in Guatemala was successful was because we empowered victims to get what they needed. So we had Guatemalan attorneys and investigators and social workers. And we didn't tell the victim, you need to do this. The victim had already made that decision that they wanted to be restored and to hold someone accountable. And we simply helped them in that process, walked alongside them in that process to get there. I had the opportunity to sit around in a lot of USAID type meetings, where people would talk about things. And these programs are beautiful on paper, and I'm sure they do a world of good in a lot of ways. But to me, it all goes back to what I think one of you actually mentioned, and what I saw in juvenile court, which is that you can have a great judge like me, and great prosecutors, and great attorneys, and all this, but if you don't take that victim and walk that victim through the process and support that victim outside of the legal, just simply the legal process, but make them feel cared for and encourage them, then they are not going to, they're going to abandon the case, and they're going to feel used and re-traumatized. So I really do believe I would love to see little teams like this, little child advocacy centers, little CASA programs, little IJM teams like ours in every developing country in the world, with the entire idea being that you start with the victim and you support that victim through the process. And that's a hard way to do it. It's very much like the whole thing about throwing a starfish back in the ocean. You know that little ditty. But I think it does work. And I'll be happy to answer any questions y'all have. And like I said, here's some references for you, especially if you read. Well, this is all in English. So, yes, questions. We've got about 20 minutes.
I've got a comment. I'm a CASA, and so it's, I attend a lot of these seminars for my own education and knowledge, and I think the Georgia Child Welfare Legal Academy is very helpful, gives us information. Stephanie Blank, Child Advocacy Program at Children's is wonderful. But one of the, and it's for professionals, but one of the things that is happening in our community, and many of you participated, is from darkness to light. It takes the veil off child sexual abuse, and it goes to the schools, the teachers, our church did it, and those kinds of things. And so just keep plugging away. It does make a difference in the run.
And in fact, the Darkness and Light program was done, and we actually had some folks do that in Guatemala. That was, I think, that sort of, when we were working with some schools in Guatemala, in the poor areas, we actually found that many of the teachers had themselves been victims of child sexual abuse, and so simply had never been taught how to respond or how to equip their own students to deal with this. Yes?
I had a comment. I was just thinking, when you talked about working with the victim, you're changing the culture from within. And I think that is the solution. If the culture has been that they're resistant because of lack of trust, and we build trust with the victim, then she can go back and tell someone in her community that
Right.
she's been helped, and there's a level of trust that's being established.
Exactly, and you know it's a hard way. It's difficult to change the culture one person at a time, but at the same time, if you do that to the point where others begin to see that what you're doing works, they begin to imitate that, and I think that sort of can cascade across the culture, and it becomes a new way of doing things, and the government becomes not that big oppressive creature to be feared, but rather becomes a weak but powerful potential ally that we have to engage with if we're going to get the kind of culture that we want. Yes, sir.
Were you able to, or do you have examples of, say, what happens in Guatemala and Latin America versus, say, the Caribbean, you know, maybe the English-speaking Caribbean, and how that?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the English-speaking Caribbean at all, or even with the Dominican Republic. Most of my sort of informal research has been in what I consider the Central American triangle. You know, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and to some extent Mexico. I can tell you that, for example, in the Dominican, as I understand, you have a lot of the same issues. In Haiti, on the other hand, I don't believe that at this point a program like ours would work in Haiti, because what you've got to have before you can work with the government is actually a functioning justice system. And I think Haiti is still in the process of developing that justice system to the point where it's at least minimally functioning. So that's kind of that's an important point too, is that, you know, it's one thing to be able to take a weak justice system and with individuals and private citizens even improve it. But what do you do when you have no justice system? When it's just completely broken? That's a different issue.
Because I was thinking that many of these territories or, post-colonial,
Yeah.
history. And I would imagine that, the similar situation would obtain where, the law enforcement maybe has a, greater interest to protect,
And-
the powerful rather than.
Especially, I don't want to criticize the British, my ancestors, so to speak, but my understanding is wherever the British put their colonies, especially in places like India, the system was very much this sort of colonial, the police force is there to protect us from you, as opposed to protecting you from danger. And so I would imagine there are some similar issues wherever there were colonies put in. And I think, if you look at the Belgians and the Germans and the French, it's all the same. All those colonies are very similar.
Just one more point. I think and maybe that's part of the challenge that, especially with U.S. influence more recently in countries that have had a hit, European, like small islands in the Caribbean with the Spanish and the French and the British influence. So now if you're trying to introduce what we have here into these societies, maybe getting the citizenry to buy into it or to maybe be more accepting of that it can be,
You've got to actually change the culture of law enforcement rather than simply adding more to that later. You've actually got you've got to get the law enforcement structure, the justice structure, to reimagine itself as a servant of the common person, as opposed to Javert, Les Mis or something. I'm here to enforce the law. I won't start singing. Yes.
Getting babies and young children since the adoption ban went into place in 2008?
That's a good question. I don't know. We still see a lot of that. I think I'll tell you generally and anecdotally, my concern with that has been that the adoption of Guatemalan children by Americans especially was both a blessing and a curse. It was a curse in that it actually encouraged a lot of corruption. And so some of these, I'll tell you this, there are whereas in Africa there are lots of orphans. In Guatemala there are a few orphans, but there are lots of orphanages. Most of these children actually have parents somewhere. And so it may have been that they were abandoned by the parent, or it may have been they were removed from the parent. The concern I have now is that you've got the orphanages getting fuller and fuller because there's no outlet for these children other than to age out of the system. And so what are we going to do with these younger children who are coming in, and where are we going to place them? And especially when there's no effective mechanism for finding relatives who will care for them, and also having some sort of financial support for those relatives. They're probably poor too. Yes?
You mentioned that there's a high level of trauma just throughout the entire society, and you see that on a daily basis and probably among people who are responsible for justice. How did that affect you living there and seeing that every day, and how do you overcome that to perform your work and for your organization to perform their work at
Well, having been in child welfare in Georgia for 10 years before, I was already pretty well traumatized. So, I think what you would see is a lot of burnout and even health problems. I mean, some of my closest prosecutor friends and attorney friends who are involved in this field really they didn't have some sort of support system, be it a faith system or a solid family support or something like that. they really would have been in danger of real burnout. In fact, you see that a lot. But at the same time, with me at least, and I think I saw this in them as well, the joy of actually making a difference is actually what kind of renews them. And that's really kind of another thing I think about generally in the developing world in terms of private organizations backing and assisting the justice system. If you, for example, have a magistrate in India who is very concerned, is just worried to death about the fact that you have a sex trafficking operation going on, or some sort of bonded labor occurring among the poor in this community, but they have nothing. What do I do about it? I can't do anything about it. That is the sort of chronic stress that I think just burns people out. But at the same time, if you have others who can be a support system to help you do something about that, that actually is what helps you overcome the trauma. The trauma is always going to be there, the traumatic situation. The question is, do you have a support system to help you deal with it so that it becomes so that your work becomes a joy as opposed to another traumatic incident?
So you mentioned like aftercare type services like therapy. Do you have any other aftercare services, or like do you guys implement any or even wraparound services?
Yeah, well, in Guatemala, I mean, of course, in various countries there are various methods, but in Guatemala, what we had internally a cognitive behavioral therapy program, trauma focused, with our particular psychologists and therapists. But we also had some outside support on that. So we had a group called CONACMI, which is an acronym for Comisión Nacional contra el Maltrato Infantil or something, that also provided this kind of service. And there were some of the residential placements had good therapy like that. In fact, we did a lot of training. But I will tell you that overall, finding finding a well-educated therapist who wanted to work with the poor in this particular area was difficult. That being said, there is the greatest hope to me for all of these countries lies in education. And I don't just mean for the children, I mean, so I mentioned that before, but also for the professionals. So this is one of the things that UNICEF put together a few years ago. Is actually they actually provided a certificate course, kind of like an LLM at Emory or something, but a lot cheaper. But you could go, and if you're like a master's or a professional, you can get sort of like almost a master's level training. And this was in Cuidado Alternativo, which is family preservation and alternatives to institutionalization. They also had them in child psychology and that kind of thing. And it really is organizations like UNICEF and other child-serving organizations that have been teaming up in the universities there to put together these kind of programs. And the more that this can occur, the more that this can be seen to be a good profession, I think they'll start building up their internal cadre of people. To me, what we need to do, if I were given a choice between transferring $1 million to Guatemala and transferring a whole lot of institutional knowledge like this, I would transfer the knowledge.
Thanks for joining and thanking Tom one more time for being here.